In a world that is yet to be fully explored, on a continent where magic is as alive as politics, banners flutter in the wind. Their sigils catch the last golden light of the sun as it sinks below the horizon. From the towering spires of the capital to the distant edges of the realm where the riverlands give way to icy tundras, the land is a patchwork of borders, each traced by years of conquest, of treaties and bloodlines long remembered. Merchants cross through mountain passes, their routes carved by generations of trade, while warlords gaze at aged maps, tracing the fault lines of old rivalries, searching for the next opening to expand their dominion. No map here is static. Each line, each crest, each name is a whisper of history, a testament to shifting allegiances and the ever-turning wheel of power. This is a map not just of a fantasy land, but of the fantasy peoples, of the kingdoms and the wars. Hello adventurers and welcome back to the Red Quills. Today we're tackling one of the most important aspects of world building, how to map fantasy cultures and politics. Because geography isn't just about coastlines and mountain ranges, it's about the people who live there, the borders they fight for, the history they leave behind. In this episode, we're looking at how maps serve as living documents that shape and reflect the cultures they depict. Our case study is Westeros, from A Song of Ice and Fire, a land which is shaped by geography, by noble houses, by endless political maneuvering. We're going to break down how the different terrains will define cultural identities and how trade routes influence economic power, but most importantly, why political maps are some of the most useful tools in a fantasy writer's arsenal. So while we'll talk, we'll be illustrating a detailed political map of Westeros using fineliner pens, watercolor, ink, complete with house crests, colored borders, and a very careful political style. And by the end of this episode, you will hopefully have a solid grasp of how to create maps that tell a deeper story, not just about where things are, but why they matter. So before we get into it, I'm going to start with a sketch. I will follow up, everyone's been asking, but I will follow up with a video about how to sketch a map soon, but not in this particular one. While I'm covering these basics, sketching a map is its own whole topic that I will dedicate a solid video or two to understanding. This is about the process of creating a map, not the theory of it. So this is for those who have decided what general shape their land is going to be, but want to use a map that will illustrate their points, something that's going to give the details that they require to their players, to their readers, or even to themselves. It should be noted, before I make any super fans particularly angry, that this doesn't have all of the details required in a map. It took me 8 hours to do this particular map, so keep an eye on all the work that it will take to do that. And I haven't got all of the major houses. This details is about a third, I believe, of the houses and the nobility in Westeros. But before we get into the process of actually creating the map, let's talk about a little bit of context, a little bit of history, and where my own inspiration comes from. Political maps have been an essential part of human civilization for centuries, from medieval Europe to the sprawling empires across Asia. And the maps weren't just navigational tools, they were records of power, of history and identity. So one of the most famous medieval maps is the Mappa Mundi from around 1300, which is housed in the Hereford Cathedral. I reference it a lot because unlike modern political maps, it blended a lot of geography with theology. It emphasized sacred sites and dominions rather than strict territorial borders. Its structure reflected the medieval worldview where divine order would take precedence over strict and precise geography. And it's important to remember that it is a great topic of conversation amongst map makers because a map is not a representation of the world as it is. A political border does not exist in reality. It is a theoretical addition. And so a map is going to be the theoretical understanding of the world and not the practical one. If you want to do a strictly realistic topographical map, then be my guest. But if you want a map that's going to fit into your world and flesh out what the world building is going to be like, remember that you are only confined by your imagination. So if we jump forward from the Mappa Mundi, we have the Carta Marina from 1539 by Olaus Magnus, one of the earliest detailed maps of Scandinavia, which I've taken a few hints from in my own. So unlike the earlier maps which focused purely on political boundaries, the Carta Marina included cultural details. It had depictions of trade and sea monsters and settlements that showcased how people interacted with their environments. And for something closer to Westeros, we're going to look at the 17th century European maps, like John Blau's Atlas Major from 1665, which detailed the noble houses and the territories of Europe with these elaborate coats of arms and the intricate border designs. And the maps weren't for navigation, they were for statements of power. They displayed alliances and rivalries in ink and parchment because that is how they saw their surroundings at the time, how the nobility would see the rest of Europe. Not as a statement of geography, but as a statement of politics. So as we build our own fantasy political map, we'll take inspiration from these historical examples, using color, using heraldry, using topography to craft something which looks like it belongs in the grand halls of a medieval war council. Now, I haven't weathered this particular map, but I did design this style with weathering in mind. If you want to take a weathered map, if you want to stain the paper with something, or if you want to start with brown paper, ragged edges to give this map a much broader feeling, then I absolutely would recommend it. This style is suited to that. But in order to make it clearer, and in order to make it easier to see the process that I'm using, I used plain paper. Now we can break down the process of drawing that political map, which will breathe life into a fantasy world, which will give you the perspective of a lord or a king in your own world. So the first step is to do the sketch. I'm going to assume for the purposes of this video that you have decided where the coastlines are, where the rivers and the mountains are going to be, where the cities and the roads are. And remember that those are the only details you need. You don't need to worry too much about where marshlands are, where forests are. Not on a map like this. Remember that your focus is going to be on the culture and the politics. Things like coastlines and mountains and rivers are going to be obstacles for the traveler, so they need to be on there. But otherwise, you don't need to know about where the forests are, where the marshlands are, where the deserts are, as long as you know where the roads are. You can pick up the details along the way. Make sure when you do the sketches that you show the rough territorial divisions. Now these should follow natural landmarks. Rivers make great borders, as do mountain ranges and coastlines, which is why we're adding them. But don't make them too clean. History is messy, and so are borders. Keep an eye on choke points and trade routes and contested regions. And when you do decide where the political borders are, remember the implications of the lines. A convex line implies that the center of that territory is pushing outwards, that it's taken some borders. A straight line is perfectly equal between two territories. But a curved line means that one area is prioritized over another, that it has taken all territory close to itself and away from its opponents. So a concave line implies the weaker of the two territories. And once you've decided what the sketch is going to be like, we can move on to the next step. I'm going to decide where to add the heraldry and the cultural icons. Remember on this map, on this political and cultural map, that the most important things to have are the labels and the heraldry. That's what we're looking for. The rest of it is just decoration. It's just context to give us an understanding. Those two are the most important. So when you make your sketch, make sure that the labels are clear, and then add the heraldry in places where it's going to be easily viewed and it's not going to be crammed in with a variety of other labels. That is honestly one of the major reasons why I haven't got more of the sigils and the crests and the heraldry signs. Because if I were to fit all of them on the page, it would become very crowded very, very quickly, and it would become almost impossible to read. This is a much broader understanding. If you want to make your own more complicated, you absolutely can. But in this case, this simple style will go well on a weathered map and be easy for your readers to understand. So as we go through, I'm going to obviously have the major crests, the crests for each of the 7 kingdoms. I'm going to have the direwolf for the north, the lion for the Westerlands, the crown in the Crownlands on King's Landing. It gives each region a distinct identity. It reinforces its political and cultural history. And so remember, when you're labeling, that not all names are going to be equal. I've got a distinction between the capitals of each of these provinces and their surrounds. And of course, King's Landing, which is the capital, is even bigger. So you've got 3 definitions of just cities and towns and capitals right there. And then on top of that, we have area labels. As always, when I do come to labeling later on, I'm going to make sure that I use a thicker line for the regions and a thinner line as we get smaller and smaller in the labels, so that it's easy to read and it's distinct and it catches the eye and it always looks tidy. Use a thick line for the trunks and a thin line for the serifs. Once you've finished the sketch and you've made sure that all of your labels are clear and distinct, what I'm going to go through then is I'm going to recommend that you use some watercolors on the coastlines. You want it to draw the eye and catch attention. You want a broad, basic color which will unify the look of the map. Because once you add the borders and the crest and the heraldry, it's going to become an absolute riot of colors. You want something that's going to tie it all together. So in this case, I'm going to use a blue on the coastlines, and then I'm going to ink them later. But for now, I'm using the watercolors underneath the inked labels because I want to make sure that there's no difference in the way that the label looks on the top of the coastline and underneath it. If I were to do the labels first and then ink the coastline afterwards, I've found that it tends to change the shading or the diffusion of the ink, which will mean that any label that intersects with the coastline will look a bit odd. So I'm going to do the coastline first, and then I'm going to come back to the watercolors, and I'm going to do the coloring on each of the heraldry symbols. Have a reference point for this. In my personal case, not only did I make sure that I sketched out all of them, but then I had a reference to one side with all of the individual colors. Heraldry is complicated. Remember that the purpose of heraldry in history was not only to signify the history and the mythology and the culture of the people and the title that they represented, but it's also supposed to be easily identifiable from a distance and easily replicated. Something that's very complicated will either belong to a very rich house that can afford artisans to sew it onto their banners or enamel it onto their armor, or it will be very badly reproduced. If it looks complicated, if it's difficult to tell what it actually is on a drawn map in small detail, then it's going to be difficult to identify it on a battlefield. And remember that that is the ultimate design of any symbol. When you're on a battlefield, you want to be able to tell who you're fighting against and who you are fighting for. If the symbols are too similar, you've got a problem. So we're going to go through and color to differentiate political zones. I'm going to do the heraldry first, and then I'm going to go through with some unifying colors on each of the 7 kingdoms and the riverlands. You want distinct hues for each major kingdom or territory, but avoid making it look too modern. Stick to earthier tones. Use washes of ink or watercolor to give it a hand-painted feel. If you want to diffuse it across the map before you add in the labels, you absolutely can. I didn't on this one. But remember, if my colors feel very bright on this map, it's because I'm assuming there's going to be an undertone when I print it out on a brown sheet of paper or a weathered piece of paper. This style is designed to go with an undertone. Now, depending on what you use, you can weather your own maps either before or after. If you've got an ink that won't run, then you can absolutely stain it after you've done all these details. But remember that watercolor will probably diffuse a little bit. If that's something that you're happy with, then that's fine. But if you want to weather it first, either use tea or coffee. I'd recommend tea of the two. Or you can use a watercolor paint. Watercolor paint will use up a lot of paint to weather just one map. But on the plus side, watercolor paints tend to be neutral in terms of acidity. A tea is a slightly acidic substance, so it will disintegrate the map in the long term. I'm talking decades. So if you want it to last a really, really long time, I'd recommend watercoloring it. If you're happy for, to make another one in a couple of years, 10 years, 20 years time, then, use tea, it's fine. Now, there's a great deal of history that we could discuss in terms of how to design the heraldry of various systems. And I'm not going to venture into that today because this is a map making channel. And I'm sure that there are other videos on YouTube that talk about how to, decide whether or not a major house uses a lion or a dragon or a direwolf. And there are rules for that, common sense things mostly. but an understanding of your own kingdom is the best way to determine what symbols and heraldries your great houses will be using. Remember that this is just a practical tutorial on how to design a map, and not a step-by-step on how to recreate this precise kingdom. Because that, adventurers, is how you create a political map that does more than just show borders. This tells a story. It shows not only the whole kingdom and its geography, but also the individual realms within that kingdom, which are formed by geography and political alliance. It shows us where people will be traveling, where the land is more fertile, where a separate culture has grown up even within the major kingdom by showing a different style of political heraldry. We've looked at some historical examples, we've broken down the process step by step, and we've explored how maps serve as a crucial tool in world building. So whether you're creating maps for a novel or a campaign or just for fun, remember that every line that you draw is a piece of history which waits to unfold. When you create a map like this, be purposeful. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out the rest of the series where we tackle different styles of fantasy maps, from regional landscapes to a much more simplistic continental map. If you like this map, if you want to download this map of Westeros, you can absolutely do that for free on the Red Quills Patreon below. I'm also setting up the option so you can get one printed out. That's also below this video. And if you're creating your own, you want to discuss ideas, you do want to talk about heraldry or how to stick it on a map, head on over to the Red Quills Discord. We're creating a map making community there. And if you want to ask me any specific questions, you can stick it in the comments. Please like and subscribe, by the way. Or you can go to the Discord. It's easiest to contact me there. I'm happy to talk about your map making ideas. So until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and may your maps always lead to adventure.